After the lukewarm at best reception of Star Trek Nemesis and the cancellation of Star Trek Enterprise in the early and mid-2000s respectively, many believed that the Star Trek franchise had reached its end. However, the late 2000s and early to mid-2010s saw the release of J.J. Abrams' trilogy of Star Trek reboot films set in an alternate reality, which were heralded as breathing new life into the franchise. The obvious next step seemed to be developing a new Star Trek TV series. The question was where to go with it and when in the timeline, as well as in which timeline, to place it. When The Next Generation began a new era for Star Trek, it was set a century after the original series. Some Trek fans thought this would be the case for this next series to come, that it would be set another 100 years later in the 25th century. If it wasn't a continuation, perhaps it could be a prequel like Enterprise was, possibly exploring the time between the original series and The Next Generation, or the time between Enterprise and the original series. The case turned out to be the latter, with this new series being set 10 years before the original series in the Prime timeline. It would be called Star Trek Discovery, which turned out to be a continuation of the trend of series being named for their settings following Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. This series, by its very nature, was ambitious, but in several ways, it didn't quite stick the landing for many longtime fans. I agree with that sentiment to some extent, yet disagree with it in other ways, and I'll explain why in this video. The idea to set this new series 10 years before the original series most likely came from the fact that the J.J. Abrams movies did the same thing. Instead of an alternate reality, however, Discovery would ultimately be set in the Prime timeline, the same as all the previous Star Trek series. The Prime Universe setting, in addition to being a prequel, meant that for Discovery's placement in that timeline to make sense, it had to be consistent with previously established canon, even though it was, of course, free to add to it. Now, Discovery would become a bit notorious for its rather liberal approach to expanding canon. Perhaps the biggest example is Discovery's protagonist, Michael Burnham, being made Spock's adoptive sister. I was surprised at this in particular because the film Star Trek V: The Final Frontier had also introduced a previously unheard of sibling for Spock, and that movie was not exactly well received, largely because of that plot point. The Final Frontier did establish, along with some episodes of the original series such as Amok Time and Journey to Babel, that Spock is considerably secretive about his family, so I suppose the writers and executives thought that another secret sibling for Spock wouldn't be too much of a stretch. Speaking of executives, some fans have speculated that the decision to make Discovery's protagonist related to such a popular previously existing character may have been a case of executive meddling. This is compounded by the fact that the information was revealed before the series premiered, which could be seen as a way to make potential audience members more interested in the series than they would be otherwise, as well as curious about how exactly she fits into the story, enough to at least watch the show. Spock is quite possibly the single best known and most recognizable Star Trek character of all time, so connecting this series' protagonist to him somehow may have been seen as a way to draw in both longtime fans and people who only had surface knowledge of Star Trek. Additionally, the inclusion of an alternate reality Spock in the Abrams movies, as well as Leonard Nimoy's death in 2015, had likely put Spock prominently into the public consciousness. Ironically, something that the Discovery showrunners would go back on is a statement around the time Season 1 aired that the audience would never see Spock in the series when the character would in fact make an appearance in Season 2. Spock is not the only Star Trek character to be revealed as having a previously unheard of sibling, but adding such significant lore to a character who has existed for over 50 years and whose original actor has passed away is inevitably going to feel like shoehorn no matter how well it's implemented. Many viewers, including myself, actually came to believe that making Michael Burnham Spock's sister was not only unnecessary for the narrative, but a disservice to her as a character. She doesn't doesn't stand on her own within the franchise as much as she would otherwise, because her connection to Spock will inevitably be seen as a defining aspect of her character. Even in-universe, her connection to Sarek is much the same. If the writers really wanted to give her a connection to Spock, they could have made her a relative on his human mother's side of the family, she could have been adopted by a sibling of Sarek, or she could possibly be a classmate or neighbor that Spock would come to be acquainted with. That way, she could still have her backstory of being a human raised on Vulcan. I suppose that with Spock being half human and half Vulcan, it's somewhat interesting that he has a full Vulcan sibling who acts more human, and a full human sibling who acts more Vulcan, but personally, I'd prefer if Spock had only ever been an only child. That was how many of the people who initially built up the character's lore and backstory viewed Spock's upbringing and the kind of person he became as a result. Other inconsistencies crop up in the form of story events added into the timeline, which are not mentioned in any of the series that take place after Discovery, apart from its eventual spin-off Star Trek Strange New Worlds. The most notable of these events is the war between the Federation and the Klingon Empire, which takes place from 2256 to 2257 and is the central event of the first season's story arc. The Klingons also received an unreasonable visual redesign, which was thankfully reversed by Strange New Worlds. In the very first episode of the series, Michael takes an action which could be seen as having started the war, and that action leads to the death of the character Philippa Georgiou, who was well liked by audiences from promotional material and the little screen time that she had prior to her demise. This sets up Michael to have a redemption arc, which she does throughout that season and beyond, but it also made her potentially unlikable as a character, one that the audience would no longer want to follow along with. The series didn't entirely throw away the character of Georgiou, since it sort of brought her back in having her counterpart from the Mirror Universe come into the Prime Universe. Still, what fans were excited to see from the promotional material was Prime Georgiou as captain and Burnham as first officer, and while they canonically served together for 7 years, they only ever appear together in 2 episodes. Another fan favorite character who was killed off in the first season was Hugh Culber, who along with his husband Paul Stamets was part of the first canon gay married couple in any Star Trek series. He was brought back as well a season later, this time resurrected in the Prime Universe. Whether the writers meant it that way or not, the bury your gays trope was definitely not the way to go if they wanted people to like this series enough to stick with it. The Federation-Klingon War would ultimately result in a ceasefire, 1/3 of all Federation ships lost, and 100 million deaths on the Federation side alone. Like I said before, it seems hard to believe that this war would not be brought up further down the timeline, particularly when other hostilities between the Federation and Klingon Empire occur. Previously existing canon only ever really talks about the Federation having a rivalry and some skirmishes with the Klingons, and I don't think that an all-out war was the only way to explain that. It also rather unnecessarily antagonizes the Klingons more than any of their other appearances. Discovery's first season, chronicling a war and being serialized, actually reflects another Star Trek series in particular, Deep Space Nine and its arc about the Dominion War. When Discovery was being developed, Deep Space Nine was considered to be a fan-favorite Star Trek series, so it is entirely possible that Discovery's showrunners were trying to emulate some aspects of it in particular. One of the writers for Deep Space Nine and Voyager, Brian Fuller, actually co-created Discovery, but he wasn't involved in its production or development except for early season 1. Unlike Deep Space Nine, Discovery would not have a series-long arc, but rather a different one each season, possibly because more seasons were not initially guaranteed. Discovery having the war start in the very first episode and condensing it into one season is a lot different than how Deep Space Nine had its war story extend across all of its seasons, especially since Discovery takes a complete detour from the war story mid-season to have a narrative taking place in the Mirror Universe. That narrative does eventually circle back to the one about the war, but until that point, it makes the storytelling of Season 1 feel disjointed. The consensus for pretty much all Star Trek series, new and old, is that the first season isn't always very good, and you need to give the show a chance to learn from the mistakes it makes then. Luckily, Discovery did, and I personally find the second season much more appealing and more like Star Trek than the first. At the same time, I also think Discovery's first season might just be one of the worst first seasons out of every Star Trek series, especially given how its significantly dark tone is a major departure from most pre-existing Star Trek media. The second season, as mentioned, does directly feature Spock. The original series told that at this point in the timeline, Spock was serving on the Enterprise under Captain Pike and First Officer Una Chin Riley, aka Number 1, so they are included here as well. For the duration of the second season, Pike actually takes command of the USS Discovery while the Enterprise is being refitted and repaired. Pike would even gain knowledge of his future life-altering accident and exactly when it would happen. In the second season, some aspects of the first season which were inconsistent with the original series are explained without being retconned, such as Klingons choosing to grow their hair following the war, and Pike deciding that the Enterprise won't have a hologram messaging system like the other ships of the time. What happened behind the scenes of Season 2 really shifted things in terms of storytelling. About 5 or 6 episodes in, the lead writers for that season were let go and replaced by new ones, and a change in the narrative from that point on is pretty noticeable if you're looking for it. It was stated early on that the original plan for Discovery was to eventually arrive at the point in the timeline when the original series took place. However, the only way that Discovery would no longer be held to keeping consistent with canon is if it wasn't a prequel anymore. The new writers for the second season introduced a plot about time travel that likely wasn't originally planned, which would ultimately culminate in all of the main cast who don't appear in the original series choosing to go to the future with no way to return. Spock and Michael dramatically part ways, knowing that they will never see the other again, right after they just made up when they previously hadn't spoken to each other in years. The Discovery is then reported as having been destroyed, and anyone who knew the truth about the ship and its crew was barred from ever speaking about them, which explains them not being mentioned in anything that takes place further along in the timeline. I think the second season fell into the same trap as many serialized shows nowadays, having too many plots concerning different characters all happening at once. It is worth something to give these different characters distinct storylines that pertain to their overall development, but that kind of thing is much better accomplished with more episodes. Instead, each episode ends up having multiple ongoing plots that are all hard to keep up with. The mid-season changing of writers likely furthered this issue. Season 2 of Discovery also featured the infamous Section 31, but I plan on making a whole other video about that organization and its place in Star Trek overall someday. Also, it's never made clear why exactly Control wanted to destroy all sentient life in the galaxy. Did gaining so much knowledge from the sphere data make it believe itself superior? Did it witness accounts of many historical conflicts which made it decide that sentient life forms were a threat if there was a possibility of them enacting more violence? Was it simply because Control started as a threat detection system, and thus even with something like the sphere data, it would always see certain things as a threat and seek to eliminate them? We never get a definitive answer. Moving on, the third season begins with Michael and eventually the Discovery crew finding themselves in the 32nd century, a time period never explored in Star Trek canon thus far. 930 years is a very long way to go forward, however. The 24th century is of course well explored by canon, but this big of a jump leaves the 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st, and even most of the 32nd century completely skipped over and only ever mentioned in recaps of past events and peeks at possible futures in other series. To be fair, the Temporal Wars had previously been established as having taken place between the 29th and 31st centuries, and here they were used as a way to explain why Discovery could not go back in time, since the end of the war led to all time travel technology being deliberately destroyed. In other words, if they were going to have the characters go to the future without coming back, they pretty much had to go that far ahead. The perceived necessity to move the setting beyond previous canon really emphasizes the fact that Discovery did not need to be a TOS prequel at all. It could have taken place in the early 24th century or the 25th century, as was first speculated, and still included an eventual jump to the future. Better yet, if there was ever going to be a far future setting, it likely would have been better to do so from the beginning. It would be a bit like if Voyager had only ended up stranded in the Delta Quadrant at the end of its second season. Again, I think a major reason why Discovery was set about 10 years before the original series is because the Abrams movies did the same, although they were set in an alternate universe, and it was the success and popularity of those movies that allowed the Star Trek franchise to return from obscurity and near oblivion. However, since those movies were set in a different reality, they did not need to match any previous entries into Prime Universe canon. Discovery's initial setting made it too closely tied to canon, at least to the writers, but going into the far future made it feel a little too disconnected from the rest of Star Trek canon, even as familiar worlds and species made appearances. I will admit that the third season being about time travelers from what would by then be the distant past arriving in what was to them the far future did provide some interesting narrative setup. The time that the Discovery ends up in turns out to be the long aftermath of a cataclysmic event known as the Burn, in which countless Federation ships were destroyed and the Federation itself became fractured. It had also been long enough that the Federation in its former state would be mostly beyond living memory, making any characters who did remember it stand out. It also allows the crew to become closer to one another and more of a found family, since they were now in a situation where everyone else they had ever known was lost to them. As the story of Season 3 goes on, however, a few things don't make a lot of sense. The Discovery's spore drive technology was not passed on to any other surviving ships in the 23rd century before Discovery went to the future, and the technology became classified information after its supposed malfunction was the given reason for the Discovery's disappearance. But it is a bit hard to believe that no one else had apparently invented it again and improved it in 930 years, especially when research into alternate methods of warp drive was being conducted as the galaxy's dilithium supplies were running out, and then the burn made them unusable. I couldn't really see why over a century of experiments with alternate means of warp drive conducted by multiple species didn't turn up anything viable. It's also hard to believe that the mystery of the burn was not solved within 120 years. It seems just a little too convenient that the protagonists are the only ones who ever get to have these things. To top it off, the so-called explanation of the burn made no sense even in universe, let alone according to actual science. It supposedly happened because a young Kelpian child named Sukal, who was mutated by nebula radiation to have a physiological connection to dilithium via its presence on a nearby planetoid, had an extreme emotional reaction upon witnessing the death of his mother, somehow sending out a subspace shockwave which rendered all refined dilithium inert and therefore unable to stabilize matter-antimatter reactions in active warp cores, causing every single one to lose containment and their host ships to be destroyed. A subspace shockwave coming from a radiation-filled nebula containing a dilithium planet in it is somewhat plausible, but it's Su'Kal's part where it stops sounding reasonable. I suppose I could see the metaphor of a young child losing his mother being tantamount to the destruction of a galaxy, or in this case, a galaxy's worth of starships, but making the child in question a mutant Kelpian didn't make much sense. It had been mentioned before that Kelpians were somewhat empathic, but there were already other species whose emotions were known to be able to tangibly affect the world around them, such as Betazoids, Ocampa, and Vulcans. A member of the Q continuum would also be plausible, or the nebula being sentient and developing an attachment to Su'Kal. Perhaps the narrative just wanted to give Saru a story arc by having the cause of the burn be a member of his species. Whereas Season 3 was known for having an event which made no scientific sense, Season 4 would be the polar opposite, featuring some of the hardest sci-fi ever featured in the Star Trek franchise to date. I almost wonder if that was to make up for the inexplicability of the burn. Anyway, this season did have some legitimately great storytelling, with the arc of the crew journeying to find Species 10C and learning to peacefully communicate with them, culminating in what I believe are some of the very best Star Trek episodes in a long time. Where the writing went wrong, in my opinion, was the destruction of the planet Quegion by the dark matter anomaly. I thought Trek had learned its lesson about fridging entire planets with what happened to Vulcan in the alternate reality, as well as Romulus in the Prime timeline, but I suppose not. They could have simply made it so that the DMA destroyed some uninhabited planets and it was figured to only be a matter of time until they'd hit an inhabited one. If they wanted to make Book vindictive towards the creators of the anomaly, they could have just had it kill his family, not destroy his entire planet and species. Make no mistake though, apart from the destruction of Quegion, Season 4 of Discovery was fantastic, definitely the best of the series. The narrative of Starfleet searching for a way to communicate and make peaceful contact with a species different from their own in order to establish an understanding with them is a great representation of the ideal that Star Trek itself is built upon. The fact that the crew learns how to contact Species 10C out of not only desperation but genuine curiosity, as well as the resolution with 10C never meaning any harm and shutting down the DMA once they learned of its destructiveness, really just brings everything together nicely. It's actually kind of funny when you think back to that one negative review of Star Trek Nemesis, which said that any Star Trek made after that point should take place another 1,000 years in the future and have aliens that don't just look like humans with funny foreheads, because the latter part of Discovery does take place in the next millennium, and Species 10C is very notably not humanoid. Discovery would get a 5th season, which would turn out to be its last. Its season-long arc would involve a search for the technology used by the ancient progenitors to seed humanoid life on planets across the galaxy. That whole storyline definitely deserved more attention than just the singular episode which introduced it, since it's basically what makes the Star Trek universe as we know it possible. We also get to learn more about the mysterious Breen, even seeing what they look like under their masks. I was slightly dissatisfied when it turned out that the progenitors simply found the technology which had been used to create them rather than having created it themselves, since it almost seemed like a way to not have to explain how the technology actually works or what makes it possible. The series finale itself was all good, except for one thing. It being made to connect back to an episode of the miniseries Star Trek Short Treks called Calypso. Viewing Calypso on its own, it does seem to take place in the far future. This was before the time travel aspect of Discovery's storyline was introduced, let alone the fact that it would involve traveling over 900 years into the future. The ship in Calypso is stated to be the Discovery, but this was likely meant to be set in an alternate timeline. The Discovery is also refitted once it arrives in the 32nd century. However, However, for the short to be part of the Prime timeline, it was made so that the refit had for some reason been undone and returned to the former 23rd century appearance. Calypso was at no point ever intended to fit directly into Discovery's storyline like this, so doing so was unnecessary and didn't appear to make sense. Don't get me wrong, Star Trek Discovery isn't a bad show, and there are plenty of things to like about it. For example, Amanda Grayson calling out Sarek for not giving proper consideration to the unique difficulties that Spock faced. Michael taking Spock to the Telosians to be healed makes Spock's decision to take Pike there after his injury in the original series make a lot more sense. There's the way Michael's hair changing throughout the series directly reflects her personal growth. It was great to see firsthand that the Vulcans and Romulans did eventually reunite, and that Spock's efforts to do so in the 24th century had worth to them, even if he never lived to see the true end result. We had a prominently featured gay married couple. There was also the well-implemented introduction of a genderqueer character in Adira Tal, and I loved how the first person they came out to was Paul Stamets, a fellow queer person whom they knew they could trust and would understand them. And of course, having a wonderfully written black woman as the show's leading lady. The seed for that was planted the first time we saw Lieutenant Uhura on the bridge in the original series. All in all, Star Trek Discovery just had some issues which held it back from being as good as it could and should have been. The various showrunners didn't seem to be sure of what exactly they wanted the series to be, so it practically soft rebooted itself each season and even mid-season, creating a perceived lack of cohesive storytelling. It tried too hard to line up with a story that it was not intended to be consistent with, that being Calypso, and not as hard to be consistent with the original series, which it was initially a prequel to. It's been speculated that Discovery may have been more warmly received if it hadn't been the first Star Trek series in 12 years, and perhaps that's true. It also could have instead had the story centered around Giorgio, Burnham, and Saru like the promotional material showed and the premiere episode featured. If that were the case, the series could have been named Discovery after the concept rather than a ship of that name, or Discovery could have been the name of the ship that those three characters served on together, since I'll admit that Star Trek Shenzhou doesn't exactly have the same ring to it. However, even though Star Trek Discovery stumbled a bit along the way, it had a right to exist as what it was, and I respect that. So what do you think of Star Trek Discovery? Do you agree with any of the points I made about it? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. I've made plenty more on Star Trek and other great media, so check those out if you like. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.